Franson. I'm Executive Director of Energy Intelligence Group, and I have the pleasure speaking and presiding over this session. I want to first thank Guy Caruso and the Agenda Committee for inviting me to make a presentation at this conference, and have my colleagues here make 3 different presentations on geopolitics of energy. I will introduce them more properly after my introductory remarks. We are very fortunate to have really 3 excellent speakers. Molly Williamson, Senior Fellow of Middle East Institute, Jesus Reyes-Herolas, President of Energia, and Frank Frasco, Senior Vice President of Energy at CSIS. You'll find more detailed information for them in your handouts. Let me just make some introductory remarks, which are a little bit different from what we otherwise will discuss in this session, because we'll be discovering North America, we'll be discovering the Middle East, we'll be discussing Latin America, and in the discussion we will also obviously get into Russia, global oil markets, and so on. But in my own remarks, I want to focus a little bit on what really keeps me awake at night at times. And that is the massive changes in the global geopolitical system, the biggest in 70 years, and what it applies for us, our allies, and the world at large. 70 years ago, after World War II, under US leadership, we established a new global order based on the rule of law and with the purpose of avoiding another world war. And providing also a system that could provide economic well-being for the world at large, not only for ourselves, as was happened after the First World War, when everybody dug in and looked primarily after their own interest, and the net result was we were preparing for the next World War. So for that purpose, after the Second World War, US and its allies established the UN and regional defense organizations such as NATO and the strategic alliances with Korea, Japan, and other Asian nations, and institutions to guide discussions of legal and economic issues, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and others. So the global order, established under US leadership after the Second World War, has prevented the outbreak of World War III. Recently, General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, mentioned this in relation to our presence in South Korea. And while not perfect, the system has served the world, and particularly the US and its allies, very well for 7 decades. And the global order we were instrumental in establishing and guiding. It was based on the rule of law and cooperation among like-minded nations. It has worked so well for more than 4 decades that in the enthusiasm following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the well-known academic Francis Fukuyama went so far as calling the new era the end of history, with the advent of Western liberal democracy signaling the endpoint of humanity's social, cultural evolution and the final form of human government. That was the perception in 1991. So what went wrong? Well, first of all, Vladimir Vladimirovich inherited an economically and strategically wounded country. His aim was to make Russia great again. And it is based on the desire to restore Russia to its global position it had under the basis of the Soviet Union, and undo some of the humiliations it underwent following the collapse of the Soviet Union and Western efforts to build NATO all the way up to Russia's borders. Putin successfully stopped the erosion of Russian power in the near abroad. He recovered the economy to some extent based on large-scale oil and gas, and greatly has strengthened his presence in the Levant at the expense of the US and its allies. In recent multilateral discussions on Syria between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, the US wasn't even invited despite our large military presence in the region, both land-based in Qatar and the presence of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. The US no longer has a comprehensive Middle East policy, and many in the region are beginning to have doubts about the US staying power. China, which until recently left oil supply security in the Middle East to the US and its allies, has lost confidence in the US role in the area and is now strengthening its military cooperation in Pakistan to be close to Hormuz. It is essential for the US as a major power to maintain, if not strengthen, its strategic position in the region that contains half the world's conventional oil and a third of its conventional gas. Paraphrasing the founding father of geostrategy, Sir Halford John Mackinder, whoever controls the Middle East controls the flow of oil to an oil-thirsty Asian market, and whoever controls the natural gas reserves of Russia, the Caspian and the Middle East will control the global gas market despite our vast potential to produce clean gas. Russia has been successful in its discussions with the European governments on the Nord Stream pipeline, and there's little doubt that Russia will remain the prime source of imported gas into Europe, where it can outcompete US LNG. US sanctions against Russia are hurting the oil and gas sector there, but despite those sanctions, Russian oil production is again at record levels and LNG production is expanding. Western sanctions have also pushed Moscow closer to Beijing. As a major supplier of oil and gas and recently of vital military technology, Russia now exports 20% of global military sales. The Russia-China alliance is mutually beneficial. On top of that now, thanks to global warming, Russia is expanding its agricultural production, and it could become the #1 wheat market over time. It has enormous potential in agriculture, just being next to China, which has an enormous appetite to buy whatever the Russians can produce. With an economy about the size of Italy, Russia is not a major player in the global economy and remains highly dependent on oil and gas sales, which make up 70% of export earnings and 40% of the budget. So it's big, strong, well-armed, but it is not a long-term challenge to the United States. The United States, what is the real challenge to the United States is China. China today is the second largest global economy measured in dollar exchange rates, not in exchange rate, and the #1 economy measured in purchasing power parity. It hasn't always been that way. In the world after World War II, in 1980, just after the Second World War, when I first came to the United States as a student, the US controlled more than 40% of global GDP. By 1980, because of the rise of others, of course, not because of any decline here, the rise of others, it had come down to about 20%, and currently it's about 16%. If current trends continue, and now using IMF and OECD data, it could be as low as 11% by 2040. In contrast, the Chinese economy has soared from about 2% of GDP in 1980 to 18% in 2016 and might reach 30% in 2040. It has been a phenomenal rise. Today's workers in China are only a quarter as productive as those in the United States. But if over 2 decades those workers become just half as productive as American workers, the Chinese economy will be twice the size of the US economy. In contrast, my first visit to China in 1980, 88% of China's citizens were struggling to survive on less than $2 a day. Today, China has become the largest producer and consumer of most products from cars to cell phones and beyond. So equally impressive has been the advance made in education and research, with China and the US neck on neck with top engineering schools, with China graduates 4 times as many scientists, engineers and mathematicians as the US. It has been estimated that by next year China will surpass the US in R&D spending. There's no doubt that China is stealing technology from the advanced Western nations and forcing industry wanting to work in China to share some of their most advanced technology. But at the same time, China is advancing in key sectors of science and technology at a very rapid pace. China is transforming into a formidable economic, political and military competitor, more than the Soviet Union and Russia ever was to the United States. Our current row about unfair trade practice in China may prove to be the precursor of things to come. Our recent rather aggressive policy of imposing massive tariffs on most Chinese export is going to be damaging both sides in the short term and may push China further towards markets elsewhere in the world. China is more limited than the United States in the ability to impose tariffs because they export less to us, or they import less from us. But its impressive holdings of $1.2 trillion of US Treasury bonds could become a significant weapon, potentially harming the US economy. Just not buying new treasuries alone could push interest rates up in the United States. Selling them, particularly on a large scale, would be their nuclear option. So a major recession could result from such action. There are many other things that China can do, which I will not further elaborate on. So the question is that militarily China is stronger. We can now, according to Vice Admiral who testified on the Hill, we can no longer consider the Pacific as basically as an American lake. China now can destroy any aircraft, any ships within 1,000 miles from its coast. So militarily, they're getting more strongly. But what does China want? Well, in a recent book I encourage anybody to read by Professor Ellison, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape to See the Threat? He basically says China wants returning China to a predominance in Asia it once enjoyed before Western intrusion, re-establish control over territories of Greater China, including not just Xinjiang and Tibet, but also Hong Kong and Taiwan, recover its historic sphere of influence along the border and in adjacent areas so that others give it deference. The great nations have always demanded, and finally commanding the respect of other great powers in the councils of the world. So how do they expect to achieve this? As you have seen, China is using the psychology of the humiliations of the age of imperialism from the 1830s, as you may recall, when the British and French intruded in China during the Opium Wars, all the way until the Japanese invasion in the 1930s. Every Chinese child learns this about their history as much as we learn about Alamo and about the battle against the British in the colonial war. So they're building the military and making them stronger. The economy continues to grow. That may not continue to grow forever at 6%, but it is growing, and it still has 400 million people to transfer from the rural sector to the urban sector where they become industrialized. They're pushing the trade, the expanded Belt and Road Initiative, with using excess dollars that they earn from exporting to the rest of the world, particularly to us, to build a system all around Asia into Africa with harbors and access to raw materials that we vitally need. They are out, I believe, financially to weaken the dominance of the US dollars, and the more we push sanctions, the more they, together with Russians, and now even the president of the EU is saying we have to find a substitute for the dollar over time, because otherwise, we become completely controlled by Russia. So that's another issue, and they're working on it. Militarily, I just mentioned it, and then finally in research, 2025, they're looking at controlling, whether they achieve it or not is another matter, but controlling major sectors of the future economy, from artificial intelligence to robots to computer chips to EVs, electric cars, because unfortunately for them, unfortunately for the rest of the world, they don't have much oil and gas, so they have to go to the next generation, which is electricity from battery. And the question still is how they will generate that electricity. So undersea, they're in the midst of a major transformation of their society. So what does Xi want? Xi wants to make China great again. Putin wants to make Russia great again. Regional powers like Iran and Turkey want to make their country great again. And now more recently, our friends in Mexico, López Obrador, he said, I want to make Mexico great again. The problem is, and we find now even within Europe, we find the emergence of similar nationalistic and xenophobic trends using immigration as a common denominator to fight the old order. This global order towards authoritarian rule, away from democratic values, the rule of law and economic and strategic cooperation with our allies in defense and foreign trade, could leave us isolated in dealing with current and future Chinese and Russian challenges to the current global order. We need to resume our role of leadership in the Western Alliance unless we want to take the risk of descending into the chaotic world of the 1930s. But I thank you very much, and I will now introduce my colleagues. And the first one will be Molly Williams. Molly is a highly respected retired career minister in the Department of State and former DAS in the Department of State, Defense and Commerce, and currently a scholar with the Middle East Institute. With many postings in the Middle East and responsibilities for Middle East policy in the Department of State, no one is better qualified to speak on the impact of US energy resurgence on the global geopolitics of oil than Molly. Molly, the floor is yours.
It's my great pleasure to be here among you. I thank first and foremost Guy Caruso for including me and for Herman to include me on his panel. You are a prestigious lot to be associated with, and I'm most proud indeed. So thank you all very much. Let me, I'm fiddling with this stuff because my 6-year-old granddaughter isn't here to set it up for me. She can do it. I was asked to talk about the geopolitical factors surrounding the Middle East and the implications that we face with respect to the global energy market as a result of those factors. Let me just say the context is stuff we all know. The planet is now consuming a record 100 million barrels of oil a day, despite the fact that the planet as a whole is ever more conscious and more interested and perhaps to varying degrees more committed to being environmentally responsible and looking for alternative and renewable energy sources. All that notwithstanding, 100 million barrels of oil a day, that's a record. Last year it was 99, the year before 98, the year before 96.7. You get the picture, the trajectory is still going up despite the interest in looking for a wider universe of available energies. As it happens, of course, roughly 2/3 of all the known reserves of conventional fossil fuels are located in that part of the planet known as the Middle East, and 40% of all the globally traded conventional oil daily comes out of this region and must traverse 3 key choke points, one of 3 key choke points at least, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Hormuz. Not tranquil terrain. This region, essential to the planet's energy security for the foreseeable future, at a minimum, into well into the second half of this century, is beset with challenges. And the way I'd like us to look at what these challenges are and how to get a feel for them is the game of beat the clock. How much time do we have? How much time does the region have to deal with some of these factors? Clock, not 1, 2, 3, not ABC. These are 3 important clocks that are running simultaneously and all of which need to be addressed. So, clock 1, the demographic imperative. The region of the Middle East is roughly 360, 370 million people. more than half of them under the age of 27. So if I'm a chart, this is what the demographic profile looks like, that vast bulge of youth down there, meaning that every year, more than 5 million young people are entering the labor force. That means 60 million new jobs are needed within the coming 10 years. Just to get back to the level of unemployment that obtained on the eve of the Middle East unrest in spring of 2011. And I emphasize that the Arab Spring, that the West, or at least some in the West, believed was all about a plea for democracy and personal freedoms and civil liberties and free market economies. Don't think of it like that. That's not what happened. As people were marching in the streets to Cairo, as they were marching in Tunis, as the wildfire spread, the chants that were called out were jobs, justice, and dignity. You could see how the West might argue this was about freedom and democracy, and as much as people would like to think so, the fact of the matter is people were ready to go to the streets over the lack of opportunities they saw for themselves and their futures. They want jobs. And so to get back to the eve of the unrest in the spring of 2011, this region, with its demographic reality, must come up with 60 million new jobs in the course of the next 10 years. By comparison, in the 10 years since the Great Recession of 2008, the United States, with a population of just about 320 million, has created just under 10 million new jobs, 10 million new jobs in this last decade. Our demographic profile is nothing like that of the Middle East. It's much more like this, with baby boomers now retiring. I'm a baby boomer. And the Generation Z and millennials evening out that profile. And yet, with all of the instruments the United States has to make it possible to provide relief and opportunity and training and retreading so that people could not only survive but manage a future out of the debris of the 2008 world's greatest recession, 10 million new jobs. So the task for the Middle East is daunting indeed. How are they going to come up with 60 million new jobs in the course of the next 10 years? The education systems will have to be modernized. Many leaders of the Middle East recognize that. Certainly King Abdullah, when he was king of Saudi Arabia, recognized it, and so far as we know, actually acted on his pledge to sequester $13 trillion in order to modernize and expand his education system, recognizing that his young people, to get jobs, were going to have marketable skills. The world was not crying out for more Arab poets. Now, the problem with all of that is that the need for modernizing and expanding the education system takes time. No matter what you do, it takes at least 20 years to grow a teacher. And once you've grown them, now you've got to give them the opportunity to actually teach. A society which, as a general matter, has come to appreciate largesse from their governments and their leaders. And so as young people were taking to the streets and seeing the power that they had to bring down regimes, sometimes regimes of longer standing than they have been alive, they became heady with that achievement. They were able to do this without a coalition of like-minded governments bombing the living daylights out of their capitals. Look what we can do, said the young people. And this spread throughout the region. And the leaders throughout the region were saying, look what they can do. It's a classic, oh shit moment. How much time do these leaders have before all of this moves to them? And that is clock 2, the regional contagion of violence and the global refugee implications. What does this mean for these governments, not famous for freedom of assembly and opportunities to participate in one's own governance and relationships between the governed and the governing? In fact, as we saw how quickly the clocks ran out for the likes of Tunisia, Egypt, and oh my God, Syria, the full-blown impact still yet to be manifest. This scares the region and scares the international leadership right down to its socks. Nobody knows how much time we have before this further declines and erodes. The ensuing battles and brutal realities of the 7+ years since the onset of the Arab unrest have contributed mightily to the world record of 66 million refugees. The 3 top contributors to that 66 million are Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The opportunities for the very notion of refuge and refugee to continue to obtain in today's reality are slim indeed. In the old days, we used to think refugees leaving their country, seeking refuge in another country, usually a neighboring country, to wait out the unrest in their home country so they could go back. People are not anticipating health, economic, political, or social in Syria anytime soon for people to go back. And so we are looking at refugees differently. We are seeing the implications of migrant movements differently. And it is causing a backlash. In some cases, we're seeing schisms in the political systems throughout Europe. Those who 5 years ago were debating the relative values of the Schengen Agreement to minimize obstacles for the movement of goods, people, and services are now back to building observation coops and razor wire fences. People are out there with weapons to protect their borders and to preserve the way of life as they have known it. This has resulted not only in the political schisms throughout Europe, we've also seen the unprecedented chaos and debates with the UK vote to leave the EU and the growing fears for what that means as the union faces a real breakup. And oh, by the way, some people have noticed some switches in the political scene in the United States as well. Clock 3, the global commitment to environmentally responsible industry and the state of global economic health. How much time do we have before this runs out? And people don't know. And it's causing anxiety among leadership all over the world. Every capital has to juggle this. With all but one country in the world signing on to the Paris Climate Change Accord, and the rise of interest and commitment to alternative and renewable futures, with growing debate and conviction about the fossil fuel usage links to global warming, the growing demand for electricity for across-the-board industrial change, including the transportation sector, very especially, very, very exciting and scary transformational thinking and research going on. All of this emphasizes the criticality of global economic health and stability in order to meet the challenges of energy security and environmental responsibility. And this in the face of instability in the Middle East. And, oh yes, the rise of unconventional fossil fuels in the form of the shale revolution in the United States. The implications are rife with debate, rich all over the country, and rich throughout the leadership globally on the value of the shale revolution. Countries were busily trying to offset or preempt an adoption of shale are now saying, maybe we could put a little into it, 5–10% of our portfolio, a little something, let's see what happens. The important thing here is that these three clocks are different. And what policymakers and leaders have to wrestle with is not just the fact of the three clocks, but their differences. So the first clock, the clock of the demographic imperative, is a known clock. The babies are already born who are going to demand jobs this year, next year, and thereafter. It's not a hypothetical. It's not about population policy. It's way too late for that debate. These babies are born and are demanding attention. And it's not just their capitals in the Middle East. It has spread. Another element to this is the use of social media, which has made this globally applicable. It is possible to summon a so-called spontaneous gathering in Geneva, in Boston, in the UK, in Seattle, without a known leader. So those who would want to go after this kind of revolution, of eruption, of demonstrations, can't. Who called for that? Well, it was on the social media, be there or be square. It's a whole new way of both expressing unhappiness and manifesting demands. The second clock, the unrest clock, is already on alarm status. Whether in the form of the violence contagion in the region or the outflow of migrants to other lands with real and perceived disruptions producing their own economic and political backlashes. These are real dynamics. We're seeing them now. We ask ourselves how much time before this further escalates, conditions further deteriorate. The UN analysis, for example, on the Syrian economy is that for a miracle, it's a land of miracles in the Middle East, right? If they had a miracle and all of a sudden all the disputing parties were to decide, yes, we're going to play nice in the same sandbox, they will need a 5% GDP growth year over year for the next 20 years in order to get back to the level of poverty they were on the eve of the unrest in spring of 2011. So if you have left Syria, your prospects of going back, of seeing Syria become whole and healthy again, are nil, not minimal, nil. If you have a family you want to raise, you can't do it there. If you are now 10 years or younger, you have never been in school. So the clock is already on alarm status. The regional leadership, the international leadership, struggling to figure out what to do with this now record 66 million refugees and growing. The global environmental and economic clocks are very shaky indeed. Some say it is too late already environmentally. The planet's going to fry by the end of the century. We've got to figure out how to ameliorate it, not how to stop it. And some say we are on the cusp of world order economic disruption. And for that, as Herman has pointed out, watching China and its economic health, as well as the United States, increasingly key for global ramifications. I only have a minute left. Let me just say, if we were going to look at these global pictures a little bit more, I would add to it, how much time is left on the Russian clock? Their demographics are declining. They are having more people die than are being born, and their coffers are thinning as we speak. What this means is Russia is incentivized to make mischief sooner rather than later. If it's going to make its mischief, if it wants to be great again, its chances of making that mischief successfully are better sooner rather than later, because next year they're going to have fewer people, and next year they're going to have less money. The second clock to spend a lot more time on, which we don't have, is the US clock. The shale gale, what does that mean? Is it in fact going to peak in the 2040s? What does that mean? What kind of debate would we engage in when right now we're going from prices of oil are going to be lower for longer versus, oh my God, nobody's been doing any exploration and new production on the scene for the last 15 years, and that means we're going to be looking at $200 oil. These two big clocks need to be added to the range of issues leaders and policy planners and policy recommendations must take into account.
Thank you very much, Molly, for a very interesting rundown of the key issues facing the Middle East in the years and decades to come. The next speaker is Jesus Reyes, the former Mexican ambassador to the United States, former Minister of Energy of Mexico, and former chairman and president of Pemex, who has behind him a brilliant career in economics and finance. He's also been a professor. He has actually done it all, and is currently running a consulting company in Mexico, in Aguila, and I consider him one of the best informed persons on energy in Mexico. He will cover Mexico as well as two other major oil-producing countries in the region, Venezuela and Brazil. Jesus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Guy, very much for your invitation to participate in this event. And as always, it's a pleasure to share the podium with Herman, with Molly, and with Frank. I will go very quickly because the task is to cover 3 countries in only 9 minutes or something like that. So I will go very quickly at the beginning so we have some time to discuss things later. Here, just to set the numbers. The first one is basically oil production in these 3 countries. from 1980 to last year, to last year. And as you can see, basically, you have the decline of Mexico starting in 2004 when the Cantarell reservoir started declining very quickly. Then you have Venezuela in blue, also declining steadily, I would say, but especially over the past couple of years, as you all know. And on the contrary, Brazil with a steady increase in production despite all the issues that they have politically and economically. And exports follow the same trend. Mexico down, Venezuela down, and Brazil steadily up and speeding up during the last years. In any case, if you sum them up, you are talking about 4.4 million barrels per day. So that is 4% of the 100 million barrels that Molly suggested, not more than that. I'm sorry, the other way. Brazil, as you know, Lula led the polls until a couple of weeks ago, but he will not be in the ballot. Haddad is the candidate who has the support of Lula. He's a passionate follower of Lula. He's less cerebral than Lula was, and he's likely to introduce macroeconomic imbalances in an economy that only needs a little push to really go into a very complicated economic situation. Bolsonaro leads the conservative vote, known for his nationalistic and conservative and ultra-right-wing views. The Congress will split very surely. If you see the rules that apply to integrate the Congress in Brazil, they are not only extremely complex and dysfunctional. Basically, they can buy and sell seats, and the way the elections proceed, there's horse trading of politics, which was introduced actually by Lula when he became president. So it's very difficult to figure out what's going to be there, the composition of the Congress, but it is clear that it's going to be fragmented and it's going to be integrated by small groups that can be bought or sold by the different political parties whenever the presidential election is resolved. Corruption and insecurity and health are the key issues for the election. Very same ones, except for health, but in Mexico also corruption and insecurity were the two leading factors for the election. Same thing in Brazil. Energy is not central in the electoral debate. It's really not there. There are some issues, but not really central. There's a latent fiscal crisis led by the systematic primary deficits that come about from the revenues, the tax breaks that introduced during the Rousseff timing. And there are necessary reforms, very important ones that nobody talks about them, really. Well, some talk about them in academics, but not the politicians, which are tax reform and pensions. And those two are also the same things, the same reforms that are extremely needed in Mexico. And nobody talks about them. I mean, we just went through the political campaign, well, the campaign for the presidency, and nobody talks about them because it's highly unpopular to really talk about these issues, and so that's the reality. Who is leading? Bolsonaro is leading with, this is the latest numbers available, September 16th, 18, 28%, only 2 points higher than a week before. But see what happened with Fernando Haddad, who is the pointed out preferred candidate of Lula. He jumped up in a week, basically from 8 to 19%. And what happened that week? That actually Lula came out and said, Haddad is the man to follow. Both Bolsonaro and Haddad are against privatization of Electrobras. That's the energy issue on the table. But nothing has changed in regard to the bidding grounds for oil, which will continue. We will have one in September, next week actually, September 28th, result, 2 in November, and 1 in the first quarter of 2019, 2 in the third quarter of 2019. So a complicated situation in Brazil. I'm not optimistic. I think nobody is optimistic about what's going on there. So Brazil will continue to live a difficult period. Probably even, it's hard to imagine, but probably even more complicated than the recent years. Now, what about Venezuela? You all know much better. Venezuela is followed very closely by this group. Worsening political and economic conditions, crumbling economy. Venezuela and PDVSA face growing problems to pay suppliers and creditors and so on. More Venezuelans looking for humanitarian relief and opportunities elsewhere, and a lot of them are also knocking the doors of the US. High oil prices provide President Maduro resources to support armed forces and other groups. I mean, it's a windfall gain for him each time that happens, and up to now it has been enough, and he uses that to do that, basically. US sanctions, nobody knows. Would a full embargo actually happen at a certain moment, or would be a surgical embargo? It's there like a very important threat and variable that has to be taken into consideration, but it's really very hard to figure out what kind of direction it would actually take. Maduro announced on August 17 a plan it has about 15 elements or something like that. But it's, I don't put them here, but it's basically it's obviously very populistic and has the aim of coping with social outbreak, and a very significant increase in wages, freezing, handling and mingling with the prices of fuels, and it's aimed at dealing with trying to stop the social outbreak and violence sparked by hyperinflation. It's known that he wants to please China and Russia because they both have clearly stated that they are very concerned with the political unrest that Venezuela is living now. But it doesn't address the root causes of the crisis in Venezuela, so there is no signal that it will stop in a positive way. Modest foreign support. China is supporting with capital in PDVSA and other companies and with loans, and Russia is helping also the government and PDVSA. 7.6 billion in recent is the debt of Venezuela with Russia. Measures to deal with military discontent, which is known to be now at probably historically high levels, and already there is very clearly several movements or areas of the armed forces that are clearly against President Maduro, and basically he's coming out and he's belligerent with Colombia to keep the armed forces sort of occupied with something, and also he's demanding 1 million new militias to be recruited before the end of the year. So it's really trying to cope in some way to handling whatever way he can with the military, with money, with the militia issue, and with the confrontation or verbal confrontation with Colombia. For oil and the oil and gas sector, the only quite obvious scenario is a continuous decline in production, It was 3.3 million barrels per day in 2006, 202 in 2017, and it is expected to be around 1 million barrels per day in next year, in 2019. Maybe France will have another estimate, but this is more or less what is the consensus. This decline will not stop soon, so the first graph that we saw will continue to decline very quickly in terms of Venezuela. You have everything is going down, oil rigs, investments, and so on. They solved a difference they had with ConocoPhillips, as I'm sure you know very well. So they actually paid the compensation for the for the expropriation that they actually had done before, and that allowed Venezuela to recover access to some valuable assets for PDVSA in the Caribbean. In the short term, Venezuela received an injection of oxygen because of the high prices of oil. I already mentioned that. You can see in the table very quickly how, despite the relatively high price, about $60 price of oil, oil revenues have declined very quickly because production has declined even faster. So in the bottom line there, you can see that in 2019, the scheduled revenues, or the forecasted revenues, are only $14 billion as compared with 22 in the year before. And oil production continues declining, as I already mentioned. Financial stress has prevented PDVSA from reinvesting to maintain production. A risk of increasing blackouts and power rationing, and oil exports to the US decreasing, as you can see in the chart. Now Mexico, a very surprising electoral result. We all knew that that Andrés Manuel López Obrador was ahead in the polls, and that he had a significant difference vis-a-vis the runner-up. But nobody expected for him to get such a major positive results in his favor. He got 53% of the vote. He has majority in the House of Representatives. He has a majority in the Senate. So he can actually change laws, and which was, we all thought that he was not going to gain majority. So you have that, and he has a lot of control of the local legislatures. So it is an unprecedented political control in Mexico. Some historians said that no president before have had so much power as now Mr. López Obrador has. Obviously, his program means left. His continuous dithering with on issues and contradictions among his team generate a lot of uncertainty. I mean, people really don't know where things are going, essentially. And since elected, he has ratified and rectified some of his campaign proposals. Facing the reality of governing Mexico, which is a 120 million people country, is making him sort of rectify some things, but at the same time he's insisting on some other issues. Some of them have to do with energy reform, because he has bluntly opposed energy reform of Mexico since it started. 20 people started to talk about it 20 years ago. He has been a historic opponent of what he calls the sell-off of the national resources. He is proposing increase oil production from 1.9 to 2.5 million barrels in 2021. But the point is the following, that he is reevaluating the central role of Pemex in the hydrocarbon sectors and of CFE, the national utility in electricity. He says he's going to rehabilitate 6 refineries, investing about basically $3 billion, which is clearly not enough. And he will reconfigure 3 refineries without talking a lot of where the money will come from in that regard. Basically, sometimes he sort of suggests that he would actually bring in private investment. He insists in building a new refinery, not small, 300,000 barrels or more, in Tabasco, his home state, and that it will be built in 3 years. I mean, quite surprisingly. And when he talks about the numbers, that the cost of that, he never gets to, let's say, not even a third of what such a refinery would cost. So it's complicated, but just one indicator of the lack of a real project behind it. He says he's going to build that refinery in 70 hectares, when for a refinery like that you would need at least maybe 450 to 500 hectares as a land, but no, it's all 70. So there is no project that can be really be evaluated. Reduce glass flaring, postpone Pemex farm outs, very important, and suspend new bidding rounds for private companies. He has already managed to get the current government to postpone that. The refining industry in Mexico is in complete collapse. As you can see, the last line there, the utilization rate of the capacity of the refining system, there are 6 refineries, is 36%, and probably this week is lower than the previous week. I mean, it's really a disaster. Each one has a different explanation, but that's the result. There is some positive news coming up from the companies that already won some of the bidding processes, the private companies. In principle, there's a $12.1 billion in the estimated investment of the 5 most important ones. There are others, but in this table only 5, and 400,000 barrels of oil production per day in the 2021. So that's not so bad. That is a gift that he's going to inherit from the previous administration in terms of oil production, which, by the way, are not included in the 600 million barrels that he actually mentioned before, because he wants Pemex to produce 600 million barrels per day, additional barrels per day. On electricity, he wants to substitute natural gas for hydro, and he appointed an experienced and savvy politician, an ex-PRI, as the CEO of CFE, known for his opposition to the initial opening of the energy sector of gas, which was only gas, in 1992. Nothing is going to happen in electricity in terms of moving forward with the reform. I'm done. It's a pity, because there are a lot of, this, as you know, all energy reform in Mexico is in the making, it's under implementation. I will stop with this, and I'm not going to read it, Herman. I'm just going to leave it there for you, for your enjoyment. But these are the pending issues that are there in terms of the oil and gas and electricity. Just give a quick glance to it, and you will see that not to do this will be a disaster. Okay? So, not good news in terms of energy coming up from Mexico, and it's a major reversal of what we all Mexicans were. Not all Mexicans, but some of us were actually as the election clearly showed, we were actually aiming at and working for. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jesus, for an excellent analysis of the 3 major oil-producing countries. And it doesn't leave us with a great deal of optimism, perhaps Brazil in the short term, and then we'll have to see how AMLO will make Mexico great again. Huh? So now the last speaker is Frank Verasto. Frank is a Senior Vice President and Trustee Fellow with the Energy and National Security Program at CSIS, where he previously held the distinguished James Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics. Frank has a broad experience in government, White House,